This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Ixalan, and it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for a deck history video. In this series, I look at prominent deck archetypes and trace them from their inception to the modern day. As usual, a poll determined the topic of this week's video. We're just a few days before Halloween, so viewers had a choice between two different spooky tribes, spirits and vampires. And vampires managed to edge out the spirits. This is actually pretty fitting, since the day this goes up will be the day before Crimson Vow previews officially begin. And of course, that's a vampire-centric set. So it will be interesting to take a look at the history of vampire decks over the years, just before we're introduced to a whole bunch of new vampires. Tribal decks are typically aggro decks. They get extra value out of having cards of the same creature type. And that's certainly true of the vampire tribal decks we've seen over the years. Tribal vampire decks have found success in two separate standard formats and in Pioneer. And in this video, we'll take a look at those decks and discuss how and why they changed over time. With tribal decks, I tend to look at prehistory for that tribe, since oftentimes tribes receive some support before becoming a tier 1 deck in any format, and it's interesting to see just how much support they had before they became a big deal. Vampire was a creature type that appeared in Magic's very first set, with Sengir Vampire the most obvious example. However, unlike some of the other tribal decks we've looked at, vampires didn't start receiving support regularly in Magic for a very long time. The very first card to have a vampire payoff ability showed up 2 years after Magic made its debut, with Baron Sengir printed in 1995's Homelands. He came with the ability to regenerate vampires. After that, it was almost a decade before another card was printed that liked to have vampires in play, and it came in 2004's Fifth Dawn, and it was Mephedros Vampire. And it's a bit of a stretch to claim that this is a tribal payoff because he just makes all your creatures vampires. Things started to change in 2009 though, with the release of Zendikar, which was the first set to feature vampires as a heavily supported tribe, and that's where we'll pick up our story, since that's when vampires first became a tier 1 deck in Standard. There are two different Standard formats where vampires were a relevant deck, so we'll be dividing our look at that format into two separate parts. It first became clear that vampires were a very real deck at Worlds in 2009, where Oleksiy Antonenko was undefeated in day 1 with his mono-black vampire deck. In terms of vampire payoffs, the deck ran both Vampire Nocturnus and Malakir Bloodwitch. The Nocturnus had actually come out in Magic 2010, the set immediately before Zendikar, so with the release of a new set with a whole lot of vampires, it became quite good. It is something of a conditional vampire lord, since it gives all your vampires, including itself, +2/+1 in flying, but only if the top card of your library is black. Almost every non-land card in this deck was black, with the exception of Eldrazi Monument, so it was often giving a pretty impressive buff to your whole board. Meanwhile, Malakir Bloodwitch was a reasonably efficient flyer with protection from white, and she came with an Enter the Battlefield ability that allowed you to drain your opponent's life an amount equal to the number of vampires you controlled. So, obviously, all the creatures in this deck were vampires, so that the deck could get full value out of both of these payoffs. The others may not have had tribal abilities, but they were pretty darn good aggressive creatures. Bloodghast constantly came back all game long, Gatekeeper of Malakir could come with an Edict effect if you kicked it, Vampire Hexmage came with good stats and a decent utility ability, and Vampire Nighthawk came with great keyword abilities. Another vampire deck didn't find similar success until Worlds the following year, where Eric Froelich piloted a vampire deck to a top 8 finish. Eric's deck was significantly different from Oleksiy's, since by Worlds in 2010, Worldwake and Magic 2011 had been released, and they provided some important new cards, vampire and otherwise. It also meant that Vampire Nocturnus had rotated out of the format. This vampire deck went black-red, running red largely so that the deck could play the powerful burn spells available in the format. The deck had an incredibly low curve. The only card in the deck that cost more than 2 mana was Dark Tutelage, and that of course meant the tutelage was great at generating card advantage for very little life. This meant that more expensive vampires didn't make the cut, including Vampire Nighthawk and Malakir Bloodwitch. The only vampire payoff that the deck played was Worldwake's Calastria Highborn, a 2-mana 2/2 that allows you to pay a black mana to drain the opponent 2 life anytime a vampire you control dies. The deck's main game plan was just to play out cheap efficient vampires, and if the opponent was able to endure that assault, you could finish things with your burn spells or with the Highborn plus Viscera Seer, which came with a free sacrifice effect, meaning you could easily drain your opponent the last 6 to 8 life they had in a single turn. It got extra spicy if you had some Bloodghasts around, since sacrificing them and bringing them back wasn't all that hard. Throughout the remainder of 2010 and 2011, Vampire decks in Standard looked very similar to Eric's, and Vampires remained pretty viable in the format until Zendikar block rotated out of Standard in 2012. From 2011 to 2012, the first Innistrad block was released, and it did heavily feature Vampires, but believe it or not, there wasn't really enough to spawn a Tier 1 Vampire deck. The biggest event from this era to feature a Vampire deck in the top 8 was a Magic Online Standard Daily, which isn't a big tournament at all. The deck utilized the new Vampire Lord, Stromkirk Captain, and various other vampires, but it never really made a splash at any events featuring a higher level of competition. We then took another trip to Innistrad in 2016, and once again, vampires were a heavily featured tribe, but again, no vampire decks managed to top 8 any major events. It will be interesting to see whether these new Innistrad sets can result in a top-tier vampire deck, because as of now, Innistrad sets don't have the best track record when it comes to vampires. It would take a visit to a brand new plane in 2017 for vampires to finally find themselves back in the top tier of the Standard format. That new plane was Ixalan, which had heavy tribal themes, including vampires in the black-white color pair. The first vampire deck to really succeed at the highest level was Wilson Hunter's mono-white vampire deck, which finished 10th at Pro Tour Ixalan. This version was a low-to-the-ground aggro deck that could go super wide with tokens. Maverin Fane Dusk Apostle was at the center of the deck, and it made going wide a real strategy since he would spit out a vampire token every turn provided at least one vampire attacked. The deck also ran additional vampire payoffs, Metallic Mimic and Duskborn Skymarcher. Naming Vampire with the Mimic was pretty great because all those tokens would now enter as 2/2s, in addition to, of course, also making your other vampires better. Duskborn Skymarcher's vampire payoff isn't especially impressive, but it comes attached to a 1-mana 1/1 flyer who's a vampire, and that was good enough for the deck. In addition to all the vampire stuff, the deck could also go even wider with Oketra's Monument. The tokens it makes aren't vampires, but it still pairs really well with the various cards in the deck that pay you off for going wide, in particular Angel of Invention and Shefet Dunes. Vampire decks continued to find success into 2018, but they started to look substantially different in 2018, especially after the release of Rivals of Ixalan in January of that year. Vampire decks shifted away from being based around Maverin Fane and Oketra's Monument, and they became black-white. This was because the new set featured a ton of new vampire payoffs spread across both colors, including Legion Lieutenant, a super efficient vampire lord. Other important new payoffs included Champion of the Dusk and Sanctum Seeker. The Champion was absurd top curve to have because he made sure you'd have a newly stocked hand, meaning your opponent would have even more to deal with, and Sanctum Seeker's life drain effect would just end the game on the spot sometimes. Another nice new card for the deck was Radiant Destiny, which would give your board an additional Anthem effect. Standard vampire decks largely looked like this for the remainder of 2018. However, by 2019 the deck changed significantly, largely thanks to the printing of a single new card, Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. Eric Hawkins piloted an Orja vampire deck featuring the new Planeswalker to a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Denver that year. Planeswalkers are pretty powerful, and Sorin gave vampire decks access to one who absolutely loved vampires. His +1 could put +1/+1 counters and give keywords to your creatures, his -1 let you give up vampires to drain the opponent 3 life, and his ultimate allowed you to put a vampire into play directly from your hand. Notably, he could use that ultimate right away, and the sweetest thing to do with it was to use it to drop an early Champion of Dusk, who would make it pretty hard for your opponent to overcome your board and card advantage. Sorin wasn't the only new card to really soup up vampire decks. Knight of the Ebon Legion helped a lot too. He doesn't have a vampire payoff ability, but he's an incredibly good 1-drop that happens to be a vampire, which really helped the deck have nice aggressive starts. For a brief time, vampire decks like this one were pretty dominant in Standard, but in October of 2019, Ixalan block rotated out of the format, taking with it lots of excellent vampires, and Sorin and Knight of the Ebon Legion weren't enough to power the deck on their own. There is still one more format to talk about though, and that's Pioneer, a format where vampires are relevant to this very day. Pioneer was formally created as a Magic format in 2019. It's a non-rotating format featuring all cards from Return to Ravnica forward. Vampires became a deck in the format almost immediately, as by this time Sorin Imperious Bloodlord had just been printed, and in this format the Ixalan vampires that he paired so well with would never rotate. A vampire deck top-8'd a major Pioneer event for the first time in November of 2019, with the Nair piloting a mono-black vampire deck to a top-8 finish. As you can see, the deck features several cards we've already seen, but the larger card pool also gave the deck access to several older vampires. This included Drana, Liberator of Malakir, an aggressive 3-drop who could pump your whole board, Gifted Aetherborn, a great 2-drop with nice keyword abilities, and Kalitas, Trader of Get, a vampire who hated on opposing graveyards, cranked out 2/2 zombie tokens, and could eat zombies or vampires to gain +1/+1 counters. Kalitas also gave the deck a second very attractive creature to put into play on turn 3 with Sorin's ability, and the other cards help the deck have really aggressive curve-outs. In 2020, Dmitry Budakov piloted a mono-black vampire deck to a top-8 finish at Pro Tour Nagoya. As you can see, his deck was not very different from the deck that had showed up in various Magic Online challenges earlier in 2019, still featuring many of the same vampires in Vampire Payoffs, with Sorin still really the centerpiece of the deck. And even if we fast forward all the way to a Pioneer challenge from earlier this month, you can see the deck is still pretty much unchanged, without any new vampires from Innistrad Midnight Hunt making any difference. Vampire decks continue to be a relevant deck in Pioneer, and it looks unlikely that that will change anytime soon. Sorin, Imperious Bloodlord, and lots of efficient vampires are in the format, and that's going to continue to be the case. As I said earlier, it will be interesting to see if Innistrad Crimson Vow can do something that previous Innistrad sets haven't. Contribute some vampires to tribal decks, either in Standard or Pioneer. Well, that's the history of vampire decks. They went from a super unsupported tribe to one of the game's most heavily supported, and they found success in formats like Standard and Pioneer as a result of continued support for the creature type. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. This series isn't doing the most amazingly when it comes to views at this point, and while it isn't currently in danger of getting cancelled, if it continues on its downward trajectory, I'll have to listen to my viewers and come up with something that appeals more to them. If you share this video, you decrease the chances of that happening. If you want to make sure you catch those future episodes of the series, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on over 20 other episodes, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and have a safe and fun Halloween.